everybody! So, I've been asked to talk with you about the difference between the romantic poets of the first generation and romantic poets of the second generation. So this is quite an interesting topic actually, because most of the time we distinguish between them in literature books, we study them. I seldom talk specifically about the differences between the two groups actually. So first of all, let's start talking about which period we're talking about. Okay, some people say that romantic English poetry, okay, begins in 1798, so when the lyrical ballads were published for first time. Lyrical ballads written by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. You remember we talked about a lot about that in my videos about Wordsworth and Coleridge. Some other people would rather say that this period begins in 1789, so when the Songs of Innocence were written, okay, by William Blake. We also talked about the Songs of Innocence, you remember the analysis of the lamb and so on. Okay, and what about the conclusion of this period? Well, also in this case we have different opinions. Some people say that this period finishes in 1830. Some other people would rather say it finishes in 1837, so when the Victorian age begins, when the Victorian era begins, so new social structures, a new historical period, and obviously also new cultural themes and conventions. So things change, okay, in general, and we know that art, poetry in this case, is always the mirror of the situation outside of society, of history, of people. Well, now, who are we talking about? Who are the poets of the first generation and of the second generation? Poets of the first generation are William Wordsworth, we've talked a lot about him, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, again we talked a lot about him, and William Blake, okay. Then there are other authors too, like for example Charles Lamb. We remember especially one of his masterpieces, which is The Old Familiar Faces. And then Sir Walter Scott, obviously with The Lady of the Lake. There are also other authors which aren't poets, but great writers, like for example Jane Austen. We know that she wasn't a poet, she was a novelist, but her novels of manners are extremely representative of this period anyway. And what about the poets of the second generation? Well, we can obviously mention Lord Byron, okay? His real name was actually George Gordon Byron, and his main works, well, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, for example, or Don Juan. And Percy Shelley, we also mentioned him when we talked about his wife, Mary Shelley, and her Gothic novel, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. So, Percy Shelley wrote many popular works. Some of them are, for example, Ode to the West Wind or Queen Mab, and also many dramatic plays like, for example, Prometheus Unbound. So, this is Percy Shelley. And then again, John Keats, obviously we can remember his Ode on a Grecian Urn and La Belle Dame sans Merci, okay, the beautiful lady without pity, we could say, in an English translation. This is French, obviously, the title. So, talking about the most important differences between the two generations. First of all, first generation of romantic poets used a very simple language. We talked about that a lot talking about William Wordsworth, because he explained reasons why he chose to use such an easy, simple, plain language, and he did it in the preface to the lyrical ballads. He explained that a simple language could convey in the most immediate way a message to people. He said that the poet should be a man talking to other men, and the best way possible to do that was using a very plain language, which was more philosophical than an elaborated language, for this reason, because it was more direct, okay? This is completely different. Also, Blake used a very, very simple language. Remember the lamb? It was very similar to a song for children, okay? Because it represented also purity, innocence, okay? Childhood. Completely different from the second generation of Romantic poets. They used a very, very complex language, a very elaborated versification, a very refined and also artificial language sometimes. Then, talking about society and their relationship to society, to their world. First generation of Romantic poets, well, they were they criticized society a lot. They thought that society could be considered as an evil force. In the first years of their lives, most of the time they sympathized with the ideals of equality of the French Revolution, for example, but then they lived also a very conservative life in their last years. On the other side, the second generation poets, well, they were always isolated from society, always, and they died young most of the times, and far from home, far from their land, okay? We can say that they really experienced a very strong disillusionment, a very strong disappointment, which is expressed in the clash, okay, between real and ideal. There is this gap between ideal and reality, a gap they aren't able to bridge, basically. Still, there are obviously many points and aspects in common between the two generations, obviously. One of them is the exaltation of sensations, okay? Sensations are exalted. And nature. Nature plays a very important role, probably the main role in art, in poetry in general. They've got this pantheistic ideal of nature as an organic living all, and the natural environment is always very important and active. If you remember when we talked about Wordsworth said that he considered nature as an active force. Well, the same goes for Percy B. Shelley, for example. He said that he considered nature as an universal power. He defines this universal power as the one, or love sometimes. And he also represents this ideal of power by light or by fire, so natural elements anyway. He believes that the man who cooperates with this power will lead to a sort of a rebirth, and this rebirth is especially a social and a historical rebirth. So he is talking about the war of oppressed people against oppressors. This is why the idea of prophetic status, okay, of the poet-prophet, that the second generation, the poets of the second generation had, was very different from the idea of the poet-prophet of the first generation. In the first generation, poet-prophet was talking about existential themes, about human destiny, about essential elements. While in the second generation, they are talking about a very social, historical, and very real idea of prophet, okay, of prophet who is working for a social change. This is one of the purposes, of the aims of art, of poetry in this case, okay. This is also very this is also very strong also in Lord Byron's works. The Byronic hero in general is always fighting against tyranny in order to help oppressed people to achieve freedom, basically. The ideal of the Byronic hero develops from his main character, Childe Harold, Childe Harold's pilgrimage, obviously, and it can say that it mirrors many aspects of his own personality to the point of confusing them. They were identified with one another, okay? So the writer and the character. And Byron was considered a Byronic hero. They had actually a few elements in common, like, for example, this sort of a bleak view of the human fate, of human destiny, which could remind us of Coleridge's perspective, maybe. But there is a difference, because in Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge also talks about the dramatic destiny of the human being, but he also gave his mariners, so he also gave us basically hope of a salvation, hope for a salvation, which Lord Byron doesn't give. Okay, so this is an important difference actually. And we can also say that this ideal of the Byronic hero, so Childe Harold at first, is a sort of a compensation for Lord Byron, for Byron, because he had a very difficult childhood. He was very oppressed. He had to suffer from a very strict and oppressive education, and he was also bullied because of a physical problem that made him a little limp, and so he felt weak. And now this ideal of a Byronic hero, of a strong personality, could really help him to overcome, okay, his first you can say his first idea of himself, okay, because he becomes this Byronic hero with a strong personality, with a strong self-awareness and self-consciousness, a little mysterious somehow, very fascinating, even if it wasn't handsome at all, okay, but this strong individualism really belonged to him. So he became basically the spokesman for the post-Napoleonic generation, very popular, especially after he was exiled. And also his language became very, very popular and became a real ideal of language, a real pattern. It was very, very elaborated. He was very, very refined and elegant and complex, except in Don Juan. In that case, it was more conversational, more witty. It was something different. But in general, it was very, very complex, and it could remind us of the language that John Keats also used. It was extremely elaborated and extremely elegant, actually. Obviously, it was sort of an expression of his aesthetic philosophy. And that was also completely different from the first generation, again, because, as we said before, the language there was extremely plain and simple. In this case, it is completely different, very elaborated. So they are completely different perspectives towards language, basically. But not only, also themes were different. So both Keats, okay, so second generation, and Wordsworth, so first generation, talked about continuity. Continuity was a quite recurring, was quite cyclic topic in poetry in general. But they did it from a very different perspective. So on one side, Wordsworth wanted to express continuity, for example, in Tintern Abbey, okay, lines written, a few miles above Tintern Abbey. That was the title, the complete title. So he talked about memory and how feelings can live again through memory, okay? So our memories of past times can make feelings alive again today. And today is a future memory, and those feelings will be alive again in the future. And all of it, obviously, in a natural environment, because nature is always living, okay? So memories are always living, and so obviously feelings are always living. Completely different from Keats, okay? In Ode on a Grecian Urn, he talks about this work of art, this Grecian urn, obviously, which is the representation of classic art. It is perfect, and it is eternal. This perfection is eternal in time. But there is a great limit, because those images are lacking something extremely important: life. They aren't alive, they are dead, okay? They are always the same, they are eternal, but they are dead, okay? And this is why continuity can't really exist. It is just an illusion. This is about this clash, okay? This disillusionment, this clash between ideal and real, because eternity isn't actually possible, because life can't be eternal, okay? Feelings can't be eternal, okay? They fade, they are destined to fade, always, okay? Also different from Wordsworth. Let's think about We're Seven, for example. When Wordsworth talks with this girl, and he asks her how many people are there in her family, and she answers, we are 7. And he says, no, it's not possible, because some of your siblings are dead. And she says, no, we are still 7. This is not just about spirits being alive, which is obviously also very true from a romantic perspective. This is not just about life and death belonging together, which is also very true talking about romanticism, but it is also about memory and feelings, because feelings go on, they continue, they aren't finished, they are not bound to fade, and for this reason these siblings will live forever, will be part of the family forever. This is completely different from Keats' perspective, okay? Feelings die, they fade, and most of the times they are dangerous and fatal. Love, for example, in La Belle Dame sans Merci, okay? Love is dangerous, it leads to death, and horrible death, okay, by the way. The woman is a fatal woman, okay? Completely different from the idea of woman in The Solitary Reaper by Wordsworth, for example, when this girl is the image, the symbol of purity, and she is in this rural environment, in this idyllic environment, which is also a representation of a peaceful, of the peaceful settings Wordsworth is always talking about, okay, referring to nature. So obviously different perspectives again. So first and second generation of romantic poets are like two sides of the same coin. They are different elements of this very multifaceted movement, which is Romanticism, a movement with many different currencies, and those currencies are all different from one another, but they have some aspects in common, important aspects, like, for example, as I said before, the sensation, which are very exalted, and nature that plays a very important role, the main role probably in art, and also the ideal of the poet prophet, okay, and the ideal of poetry in general, which isn't just an inspiration and a prophetic message, but it is also eternal, okay. So these are the main differences between first and second generation of romantic poets. If you have any questions or if you have anything to tell me, please just leave a comment below, and please subscribe my channel. Thank you very much, and see you soon with English literature. Bye!